very happy to start again with this Readmagine meeting and to welcome again Global Web Index. This year, Olivia Valentine is explaining all the huge and deeply and interesting information they are gathering. Olivia is a senior strategic insights analyst in GWI, and they are managing the largest ongoing survey on the digital consumer behavior in the world right now. If you want to make any question, please use the live discussion group on the app. I will see the questions and I will read aloud at the end of the presentation by Olivia. And also I can tell you that you have a very small poll in here. You can also interact with that. And I think that this will provide to you a better experience of this presentation. Jose Manuel, maybe you would like to end this presentation of Olivia with a few words.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank for the attendance. I think, well, with this especially then this year with this digital version, but thinking that for the next autumn, at the end of November, we will return to our presentation meeting in Madrid, if the circumstances allow it. I would like to thank again Olivia and all the Global Web Index team, because our partners and our good friends on several years in Readmagine. So thank you again, Olivia, for being here, for your time and for your share your ideas and your knowledge. And not more. Thank you again for all the Readmagine community. We're very proud for the World Development Fund for the partnership with EDRLab and Digital Publishing Summit this year. And no more. Keep in touch. I hope that we will have a great 10, 12 days of innovation on the book and the readership sector. So Olivia, it's your time. Thank you again for being here.
Okay, thank you. So hi everyone, thank you for joining me this morning. I hope you and your families are all keeping safe and well at this time. I'm Olivia, a senior analyst here at Global Web Index in London. And today I want to talk to you about how media consumption has changed under this so-called coronavirus effect. So I want to start by giving a bit of an insight into what our data tells us about how general concerns are changing before focusing in on content consumption specifically, looking at some unexpected and some expected patterns that have emerged since lockdown measures were implemented. I think this is GWI's 4th or 5th time presenting here, so I'm sure many of you know who we are by now. But before we get into the research and the numbers, I just want to give you a bit of an overview for anyone who's unfamiliar with us, or for those of you who might need reminding. So Global Web Index is a market research company, and we provide consumer insight to leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. We're home to the world's largest ongoing survey on the digital consumer and have the largest panel globally of 22 million respondents. Our quarterly research currently runs across 46 markets, and we conduct around 550,000 interviews across these markets every year, which represents around 2 billion internet users. Our data is available through our subscription-based platform, allowing teams to dive in and cross-analyze almost any audience that can be built from our 40,000 data points, exploring a 360-degree view of digital life. So being able to understand how behaviours are trending and changing across topics like media consumption, the purchase journey, attitudes, interests, and a lot more. And in addition to our core survey that I've just mentioned, we also conduct dedicated custom research for clients across all different topics and markets. And insights that I'll be discussing with you today are from our custom research that we've recently been fielding focusing specifically on the coronavirus pandemic. So across 3 waves of research in the last couple of months, we've now surveyed over 30,000 respondents aged between 16 to 64 across 17 markets. The first and second releases of our multi-market study in March showed us the sheer scale of the impact that the pandemic was exerting on the consumer landscape, as well as how behaviours and other sentiments were changing. Whilst our third wave shows us how the picture has obviously started to evolve as lockdowns and restrictions in many markets have begun to ease, and as some countries hope to obviously enter a recovery phase. And I also want to mention that all of our research that I'll be discussing today is freely available in our content hub, which you can access directly from our website, but you can also find the link on the swap card app for my session. Our insights team have been building a dedicated library of material all around the pandemic, so it's definitely worth having a look. And for those among you who might be interested in analysing the data yourselves, all of our multi-market COVID data is freely available to anyone to explore in our platform. So I want to begin by setting the scene a little bit by looking at how concerns have changed since the pandemic began. But where are we now in this coronavirus cycle? Well, our third wave of research was conducted at the end of April, and we were calling this the transitory phase, mainly because of how countries' rates of infections and hospitalizations and deaths have all been improving and still are. And the consumer response that we can see in our data is leveling somewhat. So if you focus on concerns here on the left, you can see that between our first wave of research in mid-March and the second wave right at the beginning of April, we saw some pretty big jumps in concern levels, both about the global situation and of local situations. And at the end of April, in our third wave, we saw stabilizations and even declines in concern levels. It's obviously by no means a return to normality, rather a movement from an acute phase of panic to a longer term stage of transition. Obviously, no one really knows how long this phase will last. At the time of this session today, obviously we're now into June, so it's likely that many countries have moved further into this transitory phase since. And just to reiterate this, as you can see here, between waves 2 and 3 in almost all of the markets that we fielded in, concern about the coronavirus impact in respondents' own countries has either fallen or is unchanged. In China, Germany, and New Zealand, respondents have much lower figures than others. And we've actually seen this for China throughout our research. Obviously, the country was where the virus was first reported, and it seems to a degree to be moving in parts back to a normal, more of a normal way of life, with much of the country now beginning to reopen and, you know, go back to your normal day to day. You'll be able to see that New Zealand is also lower here. The market's one of the countries that was very quick to implement test and trace regimes, obviously helping to control the virus. In Singapore, they also successfully managed to control the first wave of the virus through these aggressive testing techniques. But the country has seen a jump in cases over the last month or so, and that's clearly reflected here by concern levels in the market. So you can see that it's one of the few here where the concern level has actually increased again from wave 2 to wave 3. So just over 9 in 10 respondents in Singapore say they're still either extremely, very, or quite concerned about their local situation. So as social distancing measures obviously continue to disrupt daily lives and schedules, this new decade has unfortunately obviously been marked by a huge shock of, a huge shock across industries, and media consumption is one of those. So it's something we've definitely been chatting about a lot across our content. Obviously, with more empty hours each day to fill and complete changes in personal lifestyles and situations, there's been a lot of discussion around these surges across different media as a result, and of what the future might hold. So I want to start by looking at what our data can tell us about what's changed in media consumption since before the pandemic. So in wave 3, when we asked respondents what they're doing more of now since the outbreak, we found that 95% say they're now spending more time on their in-home activities. Of course, the media that has increased for the most people is watching more broadcast television, online TV and film streaming services, watching more news coverage, and also spending more time using social media. But here I wanted to instead obviously pick out some other activities that have seen some pretty decent increases, but that might be less expected. So at the top, we can see that socializing, whether with your household or through messaging services, have both seen close to a 50% increase. So we're saying that 5 in 10 people say they are doing these two activities more often than before the outbreak. Cooking too is clearly a pastime that many have been dedicating more time to. But what I really want to focus on here is the increases that literature and learning have seen since before the pandemic. You can see that online learning and books have fallen more into favour for a third of consumers, and I think this is a very notable change. Of course, people have a lot more time on their hands in lockdown, but nowadays, obviously, there's so much media to consume. So the fact that people are choosing to dedicate this extra time to these activities that are, a bit more wholesome in nature, I think says quite a lot. And we could assume that it would be the older generations, so Generation X and baby boomers, who would be maybe the most likely to be doing these activities, especially reading books or potentially listening to audiobooks, as the generations who are more likely to be spending their free time doing these things. But our data says that this isn't the case. Our research showed that of those who say they're doing more of these activities since the start of the outbreak, 16 to 24s are in fact the most likely to say this at almost 4 in 10. And another trend that I just mentioned that's developed since the outbreak is obviously the increased use of online learning tools. So it makes sense that this trend peaks among 16 to 24s, obviously with many who should be at school or at university during this time. But it also peaks among 35 to 44s, who are most likely to have younger children, whose schools are obviously also closed. It's clear that the impact of COVID will probably lead to some of the biggest changes the education system in many countries has ever seen, or at least seen for a very long time, and potentially obviously a big shift to online learning platforms and online reading material. But how have these behaviours changed over the course of the pandemic? So I just want to be really clear of how to read these following slides. So in the first wave of our research, we asked respondents what they're doing more of since the outbreak. And in the third wave, we asked respondents the same thing. So to be able to understand what's changed between these waves, we need to look at how many people report doing more of each activity in each wave and then measure the difference. So we're effectively measuring the growth in how many people say they are now doing more of it since the outbreak over the 2 periods of time. So the most significant change here is definitely a testament to social distancing measures that have obviously been enforced in a lot of countries now. Compared to wave 1, more people are now saying that they're spending longer talking to other people on the telephone. Around 30% now say this, compared to just 25% in mid-March. Obviously, hearing familiar voices and talking verbally is a good stopgap for actually being able to socialise face-to-face. But even with this increase, I think it's worth noting that messaging services and social media are still the primary ways of keeping connected. Most of our activities have seen very little change for this figure. For example, a third say they were consuming more books or audiobooks in wave 1, and the same number saying this in wave 3, suggesting that this increase wasn't just a very short-term change, but has actually been sustained during lockdown. A few activities have seen disengagement. The number spending more time creating videos has seen a 20% decrease, but it's actually very few that were doing so in the first place. Apps have seen a 16% decrease between wave 1 and 3. Maybe, because consumers perhaps have chosen to finally put their phones down and spend time doing other things. But I think it's when we compare these differences over these two waves between our age groups that we see much more compelling stories in our data. So in our first wave of research in the 13 countries, the youngest cohort, our 16 to 24s, were embracing a whole host of activities, both online and offline. But it looks like some of them have quickly moved on from some of these behaviours, and it's not just offline activities that have taken a hit. So, this age group might be social media obsessed, but even social media has seen a 10% decrease among this cohort over this time. Taking books as another example again, the difference between wave 1 and wave 3 in the number of 16 to 24s who say they're reading more has seen a 21% decrease. But I think it's important to say that that doesn't necessarily mean 16 to 24s are putting books down. It just means that they're not necessarily dedicating that extra time to reading than before. But I think what's really more important to highlight here is the differences we can see between, among our older age groups. So our data indicates a deepening of engagement with lots of media among Generation X and baby boomers during the pandemic, but particularly digital media, which we'd of course usually associate with younger age groups. So aside from cooking and books, which have seen the greatest increases for the oldest generation, I think it's 30% of 55 to 64s. It's seen a 30% increase between wave 1 and wave 3. But aside from those changes, we're seeing notable increases for activities like watching streaming services, using music streaming services, and also using social media. These activities have the biggest selections to choose from, with large libraries of content, showing why they obviously continue to grow. And I think subscription models especially have had a chance to shine during the lockdown period. They're created so that consumers can watch or listen to as much content as they like for a monthly or yearly fee. And what better time for consumers to take advantage of this than over the last couple of months? So lockdown has clearly given older consumers the time to embrace streaming and perhaps realise just how much they can easily access online. Some of these shifts in media behaviours as the pandemic has gone on have been especially strong in particular countries. So just to be clear, once again here, we're looking at how the amount of people who say they're doing more of a certain activity has changed in each country since the first wave of our research. So for each of the countries, I've actually isolated the top activity, so the one that's seen the most dramatic change. And in doing so, we can clearly see the traction that cooking and speaking on the phone have both had since mid-March. So as an example, in Australia and South Africa, cooking's actually has increased twofold. But I think that what these last two slides really highlight is just how brands and marketers need to be constantly reassessing their campaigns and touch points in light of the disruption. So obviously people's interests and attitudes and attention at this time are all changing in various ways. And the direction of those shifts differs depending on how their demographics change. So there's obviously a lot of complexity here. And of course, this will impact the context of ads placed on each type of media. So if the direction of ad spend is moving from, say, social media to a news site, the context of that environment will have implications for how the ad is received. So the context of those media buys also needs to be constantly reassessed. Now, obviously, the important thing to understand when looking at the changes in media consumption that we've seen during the outbreak is whether or not these are the result of existing users doubling down on their engagement or new users carrying out these activities for the first time. So we're able to isolate those who, before the pandemic, reported never using each type of media or not having interest in that type of media, and see how their behaviours have changed in light of the outbreak. And then going one step further, we can see what kind of growth is represented by adding these new users to the existing groups of users that we currently see for each activity, which you can see in the second row here. So looking at it this way, we can really see again that cooking is at the top. So 36% of those who weren't interested in cooking before the outbreak are now doing more of it. TV and film streaming services are doing really well. They've seen, so 31% of people who said they weren't watching streaming services before the outbreak now report doing so. And when we add those fresh users to the existing base of TV film streamers, this actually represents a 17% growth during that user base during coronavirus. And that might not sound like a lot, but it is when you think of how popular streaming services are. You know, they're one of the most popular services that we track in our broader research, and adding 17% on top of that existing user base is really significant. There's also a very positive story here to be told about music streaming in this respect. So 15% of people who were not streaming music before the outbreak now report doing so. And that represents a 10% growth in the music streaming market. But something that really stands out here is that a fifth of those who weren't interested in books or literature before the pandemic are now reading books or listening to audiobooks. And this represents a 45% growth in the user base during this time. Amazon, as an example, I think has really helped here through its Audible service. So Amazon made hundreds of its audiobooks completely free during the pandemic, and not just titles for adults, but they actually did so with a focus on children, saying that for as long as schools are closed, we're open. But has lockdown helped to inspire a new audience of readers? Well, I think it's far too early in the coronavirus pandemic to make absolute statements like this of what the world might look like once the outbreak passes, whenever that may be. There are obviously sizable gains made across many entertainment industries at this stage of the pandemic, but our data shows these industries will need to work hard in continuing to capture consumers' attention once the outbreak is over and consumers' lives return to normal. But when we asked what consumers intend to carry on doing following the outbreak, it's a nice surprise that socializing with families tops the list here, and by quite a distance. So almost 3 in 10 say they plan to keep doing more of this. And of course, it's hard to know to what extent these plans and expectations will convert to reality, but this is a clear sign that the lockdown has helped to bring families and households together, if nothing else. I think it'd be interesting to see what the new normal on social media will look like after people go back to their busy schedules again, and potentially how social media companies will adapt to this important opportunity to sort of fuel or help to fuel this resurgence of community. Beyond this, there are plenty of other opportunities for brands to respond to consumer intentions. At least a fifth say they plan to continue to watch more online videos than before, which again is quite significant considering the huge following this media already has. A fifth plan to continue watching more streaming services than before. 15% plan to continue reading more books or listening to more audiobooks, which again, it might not seem like a big figure, but I think, when you see it next to the other activities here, in relation to those, I think it's pretty decent. And it's when we look at this in real terms, so singling out the future media intentions of fresh users, that we start to get an idea of what the future media landscape holds in store. Of course, the same caution applies here because of the discrepancy between what people say they'll do and what post-COVID life might actually look like. But even so, I think it's useful to have this outlook. So, for example, by taking the number of fresh users of TV and film streaming services who say they'll keep using them after the outbreak, and adding these users to the existing user base that we can see in our data, that's a hypothetical growth of just 7%. Whereas the 15% I mentioned a moment ago who plan to continue reading more books or listening to more audiobooks after the pandemic represents a hypothetical increase of around 16% in the book and literature user base. We see that the projected lasting growth for different entertainment industries is relatively modest in these 17 countries. So, the post-pandemic media landscape may not be as unrecognizable as the increasingly used new normal phrase might imply. I think instead, what we're seeing in our data is that COVID-19 is accelerating many of the trends that we were seeing before the crisis. But also something to hold on to is that lockdown has shown that consumers do have an appetite for activities that they don't usually spend time doing when their lives are very busy. Lockdown has given consumers time to find enjoyment in other activities outside of their typical schedules. And it's definitely going to be interesting to see how things change over the next few years. So thanks so much for joining that whistle stop tour. I think we'll now open the floor for any questions, but if you do want to ask me anything, ask me for anything in more detail, or want some signposts to relevant content, then please just get in touch with me or with my email, or you can message me on the Swapcard app and I'll be happy to help.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Yes, there are several questions for you. The first one.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that these media consumption changes could be permanent, or will it fade after the pandemic because people have less free time?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, I think it's potentially at this point quite difficult to know. We've actually got another wave of data coming out this week. So again, it would be, we'll be making a lot of content from that. And I think, again, we've asked these media consumption questions, but I think it will be, obviously we don't know when lockdown will end. We don't know what normal life will look like. So I think it's going to be very hard to know. But I think it is likely to be the case that media that did very well before the pandemic will continue to do well, and perhaps that certain medias that had much smaller audiences, we probably will see growth and continued growth. It might be that people will choose to pick up their book during their commute rather than pick up their phone, those sorts of things.
Okay. Also, there is another question on cooking. It seems that cooking content in any format is a publishing opportunity. What do you think?
I think definitely. I think it's very clear across our data and across questions that cooking has seen a huge increase, which obviously is a behaviour that most people do every day anyway, or at least our households do every day. The fact that we've seen such big jumps for spending more time doing it, and also when we looked at people who said they had no interest in cooking before the pandemic, you know, we saw big growth there. So it's engaging a lot more people. So I think it could definitely be yeah, a big opportunity for cooking content.
Okay. The third one, as far as the survey we have done in Italy, this is from Cristina Mosinelli, Fondazione Elia. As far as the survey we have done in Italy, in the first phase of the COVID, the use of TV, both for information and entertainment, growth, while books reading declined. Do you have a similar evidence in other countries?
I think yes, but that would be something that I could look into. I'd have to look into the data to see what that looks like by country. But I think
it was
initially, yes.
rather different in the case of Spain, because we had also growth in books reading. So maybe it's depending on the countries.
Yeah.
The fourth question, in your opinion, what is the most important change in the entertainment consumption habits during the lockdown?
So I think probably the biggest change that is going to have the greatest impact is the changes that we've seen among the older generations. So obviously, a lot of older people are online and are consuming digital media. But I think the pandemic has obviously managed to bring a lot of the older generation online and using media types that they might not have used prior to the pandemic. So whether that's, you know, families introducing their grandparents to video calling, or setting them up on TV streaming services, or even, you know, setting them up for online groceries. You know, I think we will see some change down the line in terms of older people engaging online. And I think this, yeah, because, you know, I think it's likely built a lot of confidence in older people that might have been, you know, sort of left behind. And obviously it's good for content creators, because I think, you know, potentially there'll be ways to access older consumers that weren't necessarily very viable before.
Okay, and there is a tricky one. This 16% reading more books after pandemic. Any print versus digital evolution? So it's the question on how is behaving print versus digital.
So we could look into that. We did ask in that question about reading more magazines and newspapers. In our broader data, I think this, you know, we'll be able to track trends in things like that a bit further down the line. So we're obviously expecting to see some, well, maybe see some changes in our broader core research that we run 4 times a year, and see obviously over the year how media fares compared to the last year's waves. But in terms of for this specific research, we could definitely do that. I'm happy to look into that if need be.
Perfect.
But we did see growth in those for reading newspapers and reading magazines offline. And news coverage, obviously we saw big growth for watching news coverage and following news coverage too.
Okay, so thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you very much for your presentation. We hope to see you again, maybe in the end of November in Madrid, in a face-to-face meeting.
Yeah.
And I would like to recommend everyone who is listening at us to attend the presentation by our friend Brian O'Leary at 5:30 Paris, Madrid time zone. He's going to present on the recommendation from BISG to build a better publishing workflow, and is organized by EDRLab, our partners in these 2 weeks of presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, and sorry for the first technical problems, but fortunately we solved it at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.